you ever hear the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise? It's not a story the Jedi would tell you. It's a Sith legend. Darth Plagueis was a dark lord of the Sith, so powerful and so wise, he could use the Force to influence the midi-chlorians to create life.
That's right, you've heard his name 1,000 times already, I'm sure. It's one of the more memorable moments from the Star Wars prequels, insofar as those prequels have memorable moments. His unexplored backstory is arguably one of the most important pieces of the puzzle of the Star Wars mythos. While Palpatine, or Darth Sidious depending on how you know him, is in fact the villain of the first 6 films, it was through the tutelage of Darth Plagueis that he gained the power he needed to take over the galaxy. So today we're going to be doing a brief overview of the story of Darth Plagueis, but more importantly, we're going to be digging into his epistemology.
The climate begins to shift, Darth Sidious. The body politic begins to show signs of contagion. The re-emergence of anger, hatred, and fear signal a loss of faith in the Force. The light is waning. Pushed into retreat by dark matter, and the universe begins to seem inimical instead of comforting. In such times, beings are wont to look for solutions in the enactment of harsh laws, the ostracism of strangers, and warfare. Once the Republic has fallen, the Jedi are but a memory, and beings have nowhere to turn but us. We can provide them a sense of stability and order.
That was a quote from Darth Plagueis. I wanted to include it here because I feel like it does actually represent a lot of what we've seen in our current political climate, but with people turning to authoritarianism because it seems to provide a sense of stability. But that's a topic for a different episode. For now, we're going to focus on the history and the epistemology of Darth Plagueis. Obviously, there will be spoilers ahead for the book, but a spoiler for this video, I'm thoroughly convinced that his epistemology is that of egoism. Put a pin in that for the time being, since for now we're going to go over his history. Darth Plagueis was born as Higo Damask. His master was one Darth Tenebris. Darth Tenebris was actually the person who ended up facilitating the birth of Higo Damask in the first place. You see, Tenebris was a Bith, and Bith science is almost allegorical to that of eugenics. As a result, Tenebris actually headed the birth of Higo Damask in an attempt to create a genetically superior being who could thoroughly wield the Force. In fact, when he was given up for adoption to Darth Tenebris, Plagueis' father, Car Damask, said, "In truth, and in ways that you will eventually come to understand, you belong to him." Skip forward through a lot of what happened in his apprenticeship, and we can get to where Darth Tenebris was eventually slain by Darth Plagueis. As this was still during the time where the Sith operated under the rule of 2, this would mean that Darth Plagueis would ascend to the mantle of Dark Lord, and would need to seek out an apprentice. But here's the thing, Plagueis didn't actually want to seek out an apprentice. This is because he felt that he should be the last in the Bane line. He felt that he himself was the culmination of all of the work and progress that the Sith had accomplished in the last 1,000 years. As a result, the rule of 2 that was originally conceived as a way to keep the Sith stable and prevent infighting, while they worked to achieve the goal of usurping the Republic, and by extension the Jedi, Plagueis didn't see that this was necessary anymore, because he felt like he was on the cusp of taking over the Republic on his own. Being immune in a high position of power from the international banking clan, he had more money and finances than Darth Bane ever had when he began his political aspirations. He had the ability to put most of the Senate in his pocket, and the Senate ultimately controlled the Jedi, meaning that he could usurp them whenever he damn well pleased, as long as he properly put his ducks in a row. This is where we can see the first birth of his egoism. There are 3 main types of egoism: psychological egoism, ethical egoism, and rational egoism. Psychological egoism says that a person has one ultimate aim, their own welfare. Seeing as the original Sith Order was about creating a pragmatic philosophy that would ultimately work to the greater good, at least what could be considered the greater good through the eyes of a Sith, this meant that whenever a master died and the apprentice took over, this was ultimately ultimately a sacrifice the Master took in the pursuit of the greater good for the Sith. This type of self-sacrifice, however, flies in the face of egoism. The rule of two itself, assuming that it is a moral good that an apprentice will ultimately kill the Master and ascend, would never be allowed by somebody who subscribes to the epistemology of egoism, since egoism in its own is self-interest. Throughout the book, Darth Plagueis does everything in his power to try to contort the Sith imperative with his own imperative. He seeks to become immortal so that he can ultimately end up taking over the galaxy and ruling it from the shadows. This is directly opposite to what Darth Bane did in his book, where he sought immortality just so he could gain enough longevity to find an apprentice who was truly worthy to usurp him. Darth Plagueis had no such thoughts. There were two other types of egoism, though, ethical and rational, and these two aren't that different from one another. Ethical egoism argues that you morally ought to perform an action if and only if, and because performing that action maximizes your self-interest. The only difference between ethical and rational egoism is that the ought is not restricted to a moral ought. So you ought to do something because it maximizes your self-interest, not just because it is morally imperative for you to do so. Personally, I'm of the opinion that Damask is a psychological egoist. He argues himself that everyone in the galaxy is ultimately in it for themselves, and he even tries to destroy the rule of two of the Bane line so that he can also serve his own self-interests. This is not to be confused with something like hedonism, which identifies self-interest with pleasure. An egoist would also note that any type of altruism is actually just self-interest. You didn't scratch somebody else's back to be nice, you scratched their back so that one day they would scratch yours. This also makes sense considering that ultimately he is part of the international banking clan. So throughout the course of the book, Darth Plagueis sees many of the dealings he has with other beings as a business transaction. Even when he conscripts his soon-to-be apprentice Palpatine, or Darth Sidious as he's better known, he views bringing him under his wing as a part of a business transaction, where he can work from the shadows to benefit Palpatine, but ultimately Palpatine can work from the forefront to benefit Plagueis. Throughout the course of the book's story as well, there are many times where Darth Plagueis sows the seeds for what we ultimately see in the movies. He's the one that provides the initial funding to Sifo Dyas, who's the one who ultimately ends up traveling to Kaminoa to get the clone army that we see in Episode 2. This is also the reason why it was so easy for Darth Sidious later to execute Order 66 and kill all of the Jedi. Well, at least most of them. These were things that were originally planted by Darth Plagueis himself. Of course, he never actually got to see any of this come to fruition, since he died by his own apprentice's hands. Darth Sidious even scoffed at his attempts to undermine the rule of two, which is funny considering that that's ultimately what ends up happening to Darth Sidious later. But all that irony aside, you remember how Jabba the Hutt is in control of Tatooine? That was largely because of funding from Darth Plagueis. Why was a nobody senator able to ultimately rise to power and become the Emperor of the Galaxy? That's because he was plucked by Darth Plagueis. There can be arguments in my comment section about who was really pulling the strings between Plagueis and Sidious, but at the end of the day, there are a ton of events in the Star Wars universe and the movies alone that were engineered by Darth Plagueis. At least if you accept the book as still being canon. Thanks, Disney! While an egoist like Plagueis would argue that everyone in the galaxy is trying to pursue their own self-interests, there are some actions that egoism doesn't account for, some things that could be considered truly altruistic, like a soldier jumping on a grenade to save his unit. However, were Plagueis presented with this scenario, his response would likely be something like, "That soldier was self-deceived, like many beings in the galaxy.
He believes that he is serving another, when in reality his own self-interest was the preservation of his unit. He was ultimately serving himself."
In business dealings, an egoist will typically try to view the transaction as a type of zero-sum game. A zero-sum game is a mathematical representation of a situation in which each participant's gain or loss of utility is exactly balanced by the losses or gains by the other participants. Basically, if we have 5 people at a table, and then we give 1 cookie from each person to a single person at the table, we have an example of a zero-sum game. This is because the sum of the amounts won by one player equal to the amount of combined losses of every other player. If we view the actions of Darth Plagueis in his book, we can actually see that everything ends up being a zero-sum game. He ends up fronting the funding for the Kaminoans so that they can create the clone army, not because he's trying to be generous, but because he knows that ultimately he's going to be gaining more in that transaction through the inevitable annihilation of the Jedi. The Kaminoans in this case might not ever be able to receive business from any political organizations ever again. Throughout the book, he also manipulates Darth Sidious into many situations where, in reality, Plagueis is the only one gaining anything. Sidious loses his family before gaining the Darth title. This is because he's trapped in a situation where he ends up slaughtering them, and this is a situation that was engineered by Darth Plagueis. But again, the losses of anybody else participating in the game don't matter as long as ultimately one person is gaining more. And because Plagueis is the egoist in this situation, that person has to be him. An egoist will also see themselves as above others, both realistically and morally. After all, what moral system actually matters except for the moral system of self-interest? This doesn't just apply to ethical egoism. Here's a bit from the book itself so that you can get what I'm meaning.
A celebrated ancient poet once said that every death lessened him, for he considered himself to be a brother to every living being. I, on the other hand, have come to understand that every death I oversee nourishes and empowers me, for I am a true Sith. What does better than mean to those of us who have passed beyond notions of good and evil? Are you better than Bon Tapalo? Are you better than Queen Padme Amidala? I am the only one fit to answer the question. Better are those who do my bidding. Plagueis placed his hand atop Varuna's. I'll remain with you for a while as you meld with the Force. But at some point, I will have to leave you at the threshold to continue on your own. I am Darth Plagueis, Varuna, your shepherd.
That's a little snippet from the audiobook. If you get a chance to actually listen to it in its full glory, then please do. It's a very good book. Anyways, as you can see from Plagueis' own words, he sees himself as above others, and he thinks that others' moral imperative is best served if they're serving him. An egoist will only see worth in other people if they are serving the egoist's self-interests. This leads many egoists, Darth Plagueis included, to end up being very manipulative in an attempt to bring other people to the point where they're willing to work towards the egoist's goals. The downfall of many people who subscribe to the epistemology of egoism, however, is usually when they're found out, when it's discovered that many of the actions they've taken have been largely in self-interest and not actually for the benefit of others around them. This may not matter too much in individual business dealings, since most business dealings are viewed through the zero-sum game lens anyway, but where it does end up mattering is in the personal relationships you have with other people. Here's another bit from the book, so you can see what ultimately happens when the egoist is found out by those close to him. At least when that person happens to be a Sith Lord.
It was Higo Damascus Plagueis who then set his sights on a seemingly confused young man, and with meticulous skill manipulated him into committing patricide, matricide, fratricide. Darth Plagueis, who took him as an apprentice, sharing some of his knowledge but withholding his most powerful secrets. Denying the apprentice his wishes as a means of controlling him, instilling in him a sense of murderous rage, and turning him to the dark side.
This is part of a long-winded speech that Darth Sidious gives to Plagueis shortly before killing him. This is because, due to all of the enemies that Plagueis ended up making throughout his long life, largely the end result of him serving his own self-interest for over 200 years, he had to spend every waking moment looking over his shoulder, and couldn't even spare sleep for several years. This led him to be incredibly weak and infirm, and susceptible to being drunk on wine, which Sidious ultimately used to kill him. Not before having his villainous monologue before ultimately killing his master, of course. I know that I'm viewing this through the frame of a fictional character, but it does seem that many philosophers agree with me when I say that prospects for egoism in all of its forms, especially psychological, are largely dim. Egoism ends up being something that one can ascribe to in short bursts, much like skepticism. If someone were to truly follow skepticism at all times of their life, they wouldn't be able to make any decision whatsoever, since they would end up butting heads against whether or not reality even existed at some point. This is why with both egoism and skepticism, ultimately someone's going to have to employ some form of pragmatism, since where the egoist is concerned, not doing so will lead to one's own self-destruction, and where the skeptic's concerned, not doing so will lead to inability to do anything. For those who want, I've provided a detailed article in the description about egoism in its three forms, and a conclusion that largely mirrors mine. I've also dropped a biography for Darth Plagueis in there as well for those who want to continue reading on about his life and accomplishments. If I can leave you with anything in this video, I guess it would be that even though fictional characters like Darth Plagueis are larger than life, sometimes their epistemologies aren't things that we should personally ascribe to. The takeaway here is that by being an egoist, ultimately, Plagueis engineered the scenario that was his undoing. He couldn't sleep because of all the transactions he'd created that led to zero-sum game scenarios and all the enemies he made as a result. He couldn't trust his own apprentice because he, again, engineered scenarios where his apprentice was at a loss at all times. And in trying to fuel his own personal imperatives, he lost sight of the greater Sith imperative that was began by the pragmatic philosophy of Darth Bane. This failing of the egoist philosophy is something that Darth Sidious even notes in his own manuscripts. In the Book of Sith, he notes, "My master, Darth Plagueis, recorded his own musings on what he believed to be the true nature of the dark side. Although he had a fatal blind spot, he revolutionized Sith understanding of the relationship between biology and the Force." I'm of the opinion that the blind spot that Darth Sidious is talking about is the short-sightedness of egoist philosophy, what ultimately led to the downfall of Darth Plagueis. So, that all said, I hope you guys got interested enough in the character of Plagueis to actually read his book. There's a whole lot of stuff I didn't cover, and it's well worth a read. Hopefully you guys also learned a little bit about egoist philosophy, and maybe this will encourage some of you to do some reading on it as well. I think that it's an incredibly flawed epistemology, but again, reading into it isn't necessarily a bad thing. If you guys enjoyed the video, please leave a like, and go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already. If you enjoyed it a lot, then why not share it with your friends? And if you loved it to death to the moon and back, then why not either support me on Patreon or go check out my merch store? And with that all said, everyone, I hope you enjoyed. Insert end of video tagline here.